In Safe Hands. Stories from Leeds' pioneering hand transplant team. Coming up in this episode.
Ever since Friends, the sitcom series, there seems to have been a sort of wave across the Western world of hugging, not shaking hands. But the point about shaking hands is when you shake somebody's hands, you feel them and you have to look them in the face. My children will tell you that I like to shake hands with them rather than hug them because it's just a telling way to say hello and how are you. You get a lot of information very quickly.
Thank you for joining me for this podcast from the UK's hand transplant team based at Leeds Teaching Hospitals NHS Trust. I'm Caroline Verdon, and in this episode, we meet Professor Simon Kay. He's a world-leading authority on hand transplants, and he set up the unit here in the UK in 2013.
So a large part of my work is working with children with hand abnormalities, and that has been my goal in life since the age of about 12. So when I was about 5, I had an electrocution injury to my hand. I was at home with my mother and we had an electric bar fire and I switched it on. And of course it doesn't go red immediately. And so I grabbed it thinking it wasn't energized as a child would. And of course it was, and I was electrocuted and it burnt my finger. And I lived in Channel Islands then, so I was flown out to Odstock Plastic Surgery Unit in Salisbury, where I had what I would now see as inappropriate and heroic efforts to save me from losing a finger. And I had to have skin grafts and so on. So that was both instructive about parent-child guilt, about parent-child separation, and about the complexities and interest of reconstructive surgery, and in the end about hands. Because as I got older, I had a very scarred and deformed part of my hand. And the more activities I wanted to take part in, the more it was in the way. And it was both unsightly, because the aesthetics of the hand are important. It was both unsightly and inconvenient. And so I went back to my parents and said, I think I'd like to be rid of this digit. And by then they'd invested, as had doctors, a lot of time and effort in saving it. And so my father took me off to see some Harley Street bigwig who wanted to do some clever, complicated thing. And I didn't like the sound of it at all. I was about 14 then, 15. So I went to my GP when we got back to Channel Islands and he amputated it for me. And it was the best thing I've ever done. And it taught me that whole episode, which was a formative part of my life, had lessons that have carried me through life. One is about the enormous guilt my mother felt and how that guilt drove her to find, complex care for me, how specialists always over-egg it and don't do the simple things. Partly because I suppose if you call yourself a specialist, you feel you should do something special. Well, I don't think that's necessary. I think you should be able to do something special. You shouldn't feel you have to do it. And it taught me that what matters is what's between the ears and not what's on the hand. So it was important for me to have this. I was, as a young child, able to express my wishes, and luckily I had a GP who would listen. All of those are things that I think are really valuable lessons for any doctor.
So that's what's really sort of fueled or driven your interest.
In this, in my view, misguided endeavour to save a finger, which involved several operations and very long periods of hugely unpleasant therapy, nobody really seemed to be thinking about whether it was worth it. And there was an assumption that if we started, we have to finish and we can't change course. I don't know, some of that might have been my parents being slightly intimidated by the sort of great man surgeon thing and the surgeon feeling just carry on down the same path. But it also had a profound effect on me in that I developed very bad stammer, which I think was quite a defining part of my childhood because it was so bad that I was essentially mute. I didn't talk to anyone really at all, and I dreaded conversation and so on. As you can see, it's better now.
Yeah, you wouldn't know.
Well, you sometimes hear me on the phone or on radio. But that had a big effect on my life, and it all comes from just picking up that bar fire. And so I realized that these things that we see as, oh, it's just a small burn, can have consequences that fan out throughout the life. Some of them are good and bad. They're not everything bad flows from an injury like that. I mean, one of the good things was that I learned children who face adversity in childhood and come through it with the help of a strong structure, whether it's religious or family or organization-based, they often become very resilient and also very empathetic and contemplative. So they develop skills early that other children don't. I'm not advocating that you should put every child through but it's interesting that that's what happens. And we see that time and again. There are many examples from public life and also in my clinics. You see it all the time. So it did have a strong influence on me, and it made me think about hands and made me think about hand surgery. And hand surgery was just in its infancy after the war. And the idea that you could mitigate injury and congenital deformity and differences in the hand was utterly fascinating to me. And so that's why I decided to do medicine. And that's why I decided to do reconstructive surgery.
And so for a large part of your career, it obviously didn't involve the transplantation. How did that come about?
Well, first of all, I've had several things that I wanted to contribute and think I have in children's hand surgery. And amongst those are that the psychology and behaviour of the child and the family are far more important than the physical problem with the hand. So straight away, I don't think surgery is the be-all and end-all. I think behaviour and understanding and if you don't have that, how can you advise? And so that's why right from the get-go, when I was a consultant, I had a psychologist with me in clinic all the time. And as I say, it's what's between the ears that matters, not what's on the hand. But then also, I trained part of my time with a chap called Graham Lister in Louisville, Kentucky, who was an unusual personality and a very good surgeon, good teacher. And he started doing microsurgical transplants of toes to hands for congenital absence of, say, thumbs. And so I was always a committed microsurgeon, just in the sort of new wave of microsurgery in the 80s. And so that's what we came to Leeds. A colleague of mine and I came to Leeds to set up a microsurgery service here. And he was a very good microsurgeon. And he did a lot of the head and neck and reconstruction microsurgery. And I did hand reconstruction. So I was doing a lot of transplanting tissue to the hand. Microsurgery refers to the idea that with the aid of an operating microscope, you can join together very small blood vessels. And so you can take, say, a toe off a foot, transplant it to the hand, and give it blood flow and life immediately by joining up the very small blood vessels. So I was doing children's reconstructive surgery with microsurgery, and I trained in Kentucky in the States, and that was a unit that was beginning to look at the pros and cons of hand transplantation. And I was there in sort of 85, 86, and they did their first transplant in 2000, so 15 years later, but they're already beginning to talk about it. And the team that did the transplant was the team I'd worked with, so I knew them well.
And when they were first beginning to talk about it, and when that became a genuine conversation of possibility, what were your thoughts on it?
Oh, I thought it was a great idea. But it's interesting, the history of the first modern era transplants is the first one was done in Lyon in France by a guy called Max Dubenard and his team, but with an Australian urological microsurgeon and a patient from New Zealand. And you say, why is that happening there? And it was in retrospect, I think everybody involved in that would agree it was a poorly thought out procedure. The patient was really unsuitable. He hadn't been assessed properly. His requests weren't met. His conditions that he needed weren't met. And he, in fact, began to psychologically reject his hand. Some people question whether such a thing exists, but it does. He didn't like his hand. So he stopped taking his immunosuppression and then immunologically rejected it with the intent of losing it. So 3 months later, Louisville did their hand transplant. And that's still attached and alive and working well. And the reason, there are two differences. One is that Louisville spent 10 years working up towards it, analysing it, researching, looking at attitudes, understanding the psychosocial consequences and so on. They screened their patients very carefully. They knew exactly what the patient would tolerate and wouldn't tolerate. And so the chance of psychological rejection was much smaller. And it's interesting that the Lyon transplant was 3 months before Louisville one, and one can't help wondering if there was a rush to be first there. But so then Louisville did it in the year 2000, January, I think it was 2000. And so I went to our trust medical director and I said, we've got all the know-how to do this. There's a transplant service in Leeds for organs. We've got the best microsurgery service in Britain. Why don't we do this? We need to start getting on this. And he said something to me. He's a very nice chap, ended up friends. He said, I think this is really interesting, but I think it would be better to be in the vanguard but not actually carry the flag. And I thought that was a very nice way of putting it. So get ready to be there early, but not the first, because there's a lot of risk attached, both reputationally for me and for the hospital, but also for the patient physically. So then I kind of got busy with other stuff, and it went on the back burner. And then a very nice chap called Raj Prasad came along to me in probably about 2009-10 and said, you should get off your arse and do hand transplant. He was a transplant surgeon. And it was 10 years later, and I thought, yeah, I haven't reactivated that. So I started down that road, realized that it was actually a very difficult road to get agreement to do. And that rather than just setting up a plate and saying, anybody with no hand, come along, I'll give you one, we had to get a lot of permissions, cross a lot of boundaries, find a lot of funding, put together a team. And we finally did that and persuaded the trust that they would do the first one financially at risk. That is, say they'd go out and try and recoup the funding after it had happened, because there was no basis in those days for negotiating that ahead. So we did our first transplant 12 years ago. And a month later, they changed the commissioning rules. So we couldn't do them without a centrally agreed contract. And that took 3 years to negotiate and compete for and finally get. I say that in one sentence, but it was 3 years of learning how to maneuver in NHS culture and how to persuade people that if they've got a limited pot of money, this is something they should buy instead of something else. But we got there eventually. And so we became centrally funded. And that's an enormous difference to other units around the world, because other units like the American units, they have to rely on either treating only very rich patients, because it's expensive business, treating people who are funded by a charity, looking for legal compensation as part of treatment if they've lost it in an industrial accident. And in fact, the most prolific hand transplant unit now is Philadelphia, where my very good friend Scott Levin runs the unit. And his last two patients had been from overseas, wealthy patients from overseas. So that's good that he's doing it, but it's kind of not providing the local service. But NHS England had both the competence and vision to see that this couldn't be provided by local funding. It had to be a national structure, and they stepped in and funded it. So huge kudos to them.
And so let's have a look then at the importance of hands. How significant are they to, our existence?
It seems that most people, when they talk about hands and loss of a hand or impairment of a hand, they talk about mechanical function. You often hear the phrase pincer function or pincer grip or strength of grip, as if it's just simply a gripping shovel on the end of a hydraulic limb. And of course, the truth is that it's far more complex. The first thing to say is hands are paired and they're mirror images. They work together and they work in front of you. And so they complete a circle with your head and both arms. your head at the center directing things, and your hands out there doing all the things they do. And the things they do are far more than simple mechanical. In fact, there is no simple mechanical. The mechanics of the hand are incredibly intricate and beautiful in any case, but the mechanical function is the one people focus on. Of course, there's a sensory function. And when I say a sensory function, when you think about hands, the amount of different sensory modalities they can detect, not just touch, light touch, vibration, hot and cold, proprioception, by which we mean they know the position they are at all times, so you can know what your hand is doing when you're not looking. These are remarkable qualities. So we've got the mechanical and the sensory qualities. But then there's something that transcends that. And I think it's a deeply sort of human cultural thing, which is based in the fact that the hand, the face, and language are three things that really do distinguish humans. And of course, the thing that distinguishes humans most is their brain and therefore their mind. And we don't know whether animals have minds, by which I mean the consciousness of others. But I'm convinced that hands play a part in the development of language and so the development of the brain in reciprocal ways. That sounds a bit airy-fairy and complex, but let me give you an example. One of the things that hands do is point. And we're the only animal that points. We point with what's called meant meaning. That is, it has meaning and we intend it to have meaning. It's not trained into us like a pointer dog. And indeed, pointing is one of the distinguishers from neurodivergence. It's a milestone you have to meet as a baby in order to be meeting your milestones. And you should be pointing within the first year. And then when we see pointing, the interesting thing about pointing, it's done with the index finger, which is why it's called the index finger. And in order to point, you have to have somebody to point for. So you're the pointer and there's a consumer of the pointing and the thing you're pointing at. And then if you want to tell somebody the name of something, you indicate it and you say stone or tree. And then you suddenly have a language. And once you have a language, you can then communicate, and you can communicate abstract things. So back to the functions of the hand, I think there's something very deeply embedded in humans that even though we don't think about it, we recognize our hands are very important for how we got to where we are. And so when people talk about hands and talk just about mechanical function, sensory function, they forget all the higher functions hands have. So in communication, in gesturing, in caring, the caring touch of a warm hand, the touch of human warmth is a very caring thing for a child or for a partner or for an ill person. We decorate them. We put rings on them, we tattoo them, we paint our nails. And of course, they're an important part of sex. Almost impossible to have enjoyable sex without using your hands in some way. I don't mean just masturbating, but also in sex with a partner. And then finally, one of the most brutal and effective punishments throughout the ages, practiced throughout the world, is the amputation of the hands. So for stealing or for adultery or just as a punitive thing, I think William the Conqueror cut hands and feet off some of his victims to encourage the others. It happens throughout the world, and we see it happening in Africa now. And that's a brutal, dehumanizing thing. And that's why it's so brutal, because it dehumanizes you. So I think for all these reasons, I hate it when people talk, in my view, ignorantly about the mechanical function of the hand. There's so much more. Finally, as I say, they work as a ring, in concert with each other. They're mirror images. They fit together, and they do complementary tasks. And we have one preferred hand. I don't like the idea of dominant hand. We have preferred hands for most activities. And at the center of that is the human face, which incidentally, interestingly, has a lot of the same qualities. It's unique, it's aesthetic, it has sensory, both the extraordinarily sensitive proprioception of your lips and tongue, the sense of taste, that is the seat of vision and hearing. It also moves and gestures, facial movement, and it's an important part of sex. So it's quite interesting that they share these things. And they're the only two parts of the body that are always on view. So it's a lot more concerted and complex than most people stop and think about.
And I suppose we also use them in every kind of relationship that we have, whether it is a business relationship and there's the expected handshake or kids high-fiving or whatever it
Well, now
may
handshaking
be.
is really interesting for me because there's all sorts of cod philosophy and history around it. And ever since Friends, the sitcom series, there seems to have been a sort of wave across the Western world of hugging, not shaking hands, particularly in the Anglo-Saxon world, where shaking hands was sort of slightly austere and thing to do. But the point about shaking hands is when you shake somebody's hands, you feel them. So you actually hold their hand, you feel its quality. Is it warm? Is it cold? Is it sweaty? Is it soft? Is it strong? Is it weak? And in order to shake somebody's hand, you have to look them in the face. You can't shake the hand while you're looking away. If you hug somebody, you avoid face-to-face examination, and you don't get much sensory feedback because you put your arms around them and sometimes give them that kind of phony pat on the back. But that's very different from the handshake. The French do it beautifully. They shake hands and kiss. Cheek, cheek, 1, 1, 1, 2, 3. But shaking hands, I think, I'd hate to see that go because it tells you so much more immediately about the person you're meeting.
That's really interesting. And something I think it's easy to overlook.
Absolutely.
And to just bypass this whole gigantic part of society.
And during COVID, when we were encouraged to sort of bump elbows, if anything, then people were very slow to get back to shaking hands. But I prefer shaking hands to any other form of greeting. In fact, my children will tell you that I like to shake hands with them rather than hug them because it's just, for me, it's a telling way to say hello and how are you. You get a lot of information very quickly.
Coming up on our next episode, we meet Jamie Mines. He was a semi-professional footballer from Swindon who lost his legs and hands in a building site accident.
Yeah, it was hard, I must admit. When I first woke up, I did ask why did they do it, why did they save me? At first, I said I would have any hand. And then they asked me if I would have different colour skin or a lady's hand. And then I thought about it. I thought, because I'm quite a big, tall lad, I actually said, oh no, I'd like to have a guy's hand, actually. And similar, like height, weight, skin colour. I got a bit choosy when it came to it. I thought, I'm going to be upbeat for the rest of my life.
And you can hear more from Jamie Mines on our next episode, which is out on the 30th of November. This podcast is an Under the Mast studio production.